Hello student, welcome to lecture 1.5 of the Middle Passage. In this lecture, we will talk about different things. First, the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, then the characteristics of a slave ship, the women on the slave ship, the slave resistance on the slave ship, and then the origins and destinations of slaves, the landing and sale of slaves in the Americas. Next, I will talk about the seasoning or the breaking of the slaves. And finally, we will talk about two witnesses of the Middle Passage. One is Elauda Iquiano, who was a slave, and the other one was John Newton, who was a slave trader or slaver. First, let's talk about the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. As we already know from the previous lecture, the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean was known as the Middle Passage, and it was the most horrible experience endured by the African slaves. The voyage lasted about 3 to 6 months, depending on different factors such as pirate attacks, hurricanes, favorable winds which may shorten the trip, and doldrums which may extend the trip for many weeks. Now let's talk about the ship itself. So the ship was described by some historians as a useful machine. By this they mean that the ships by this time were very reliable and efficient. They were built to resist storm, and the ships were also better ventilated and included a device called bondage hardware. So these are anchors to which the slaves were attached. The slave ship also can be also tight packed, which means overcrowded, or loose packed, which means that there are less people, less slaves on the ship. This figure shows us the diagram of a slave ship with different decks and the rows, different rows of slaves attached to each other and attached to what you call earlier bondage hardware. Now let's talk about the women on the slave ship. We are talking here about the so-called double jeopardy of the women. First, the price of the women were usually half of those of men. But in addition to that, the crews of a ship also abuse these women sexually. And the fact that the women were usually held in separate compartments made them an easy target of this sexual predator. With regard to the slave resistance and rebellion on the slave ship, African slaves often rebel against the crew rather than accepting blindly the captivity. They also knew that the failure of a rebellion could expose them to harsh punishment, but they did it anyway. And if they did not resist, some of them just jumped overboard or starved to death. Concerning the origins and destinations of the slaves, as mentioned in the previous lecture, and as we can see also again in the next figure, most African slaves came from the region of Western and Central Africa, from Senegal to Angola, Nevertheless, the great majority of them went to South America, especially to Brazil or to the Caribbean islands. And only a small percentage went to the English colony in North America, which is the modern-day United States or Canada. So this map shows us the origins and destinations of slaves. As you can see, the great majority came from the Western and Central Africa. So that's the area in brown on the map. Very few slaves came from Eastern and Southern Africa. And concerning the destinations, the great majority of the slaves went to South America, once again, especially to Brazil or the Caribbean islands, and a small percentage went to the north, to the British colonies in North America. Now let's talk about the landing and sale of the slaves in the Americas. The crew of the ships prepare the slaves for the sale. They try to conceal any wounds and bruises. However, the cruelty, the confinement and disease during the Middle Passage were not easily concealed. But on the market, on the slave market, the slaves have to undergo a close inspection by the buyer. So they have to look at the teeth, they have to look at a different part of the body, and decide how much price they would pay for the slave. And once the purchase was agreed, the buyer just grab and rope the slave that they choose. So once they were sold to new masters, the new master have to break the slaves. So this is the process known as seasoning. So the seasoning was the disciplinary process by which the slaves were made effective worker or docile worker. So the slaves on the plantation, they were divided into different groups. First, you have the Creoles, so those are the mixed race. You have also the old Africans, the slaves who were there for many years, and then you have the new Africans. So usually it was incumbent upon the Creole and the old Africans to train the new slaves. So the new slaves were given new names. They were taught European languages such as Spanish, English, or French, depending on the language of a new master. And then they were trained to work on the field. And the seasoning was deemed successful if a slave survived the process, which means they did not die, he did not die. And then the slave also was adopted to new food, to the new climate, and start to speak the language of a master. And they were also adjusted psychologically. So these are the signs that the slaves were seasoned or broken. To conclude this lecture, let's talk about two witnesses of the Middle Passage. First, we have Olaudah Ikiano, who was a slave, and then we have John Newton, who was a slave trader or slaver. First, concerning Olaudah Ikiano, Olaudah Ikiano was captured in West Africa and then sent to West Indies. West Indies is in South America. he described his suffering, his ordeal in a book, and according to him in that book, the slave ship was overcrowded, unsanitary, dark, and he could also hear the suffering of the slaves from a chafing of a chain on their skin. He also described the desperation of some slaves who decide to jump overboard and prefer drowning than accepting the captivity. And from time to time, the crews of the ship force the slaves to sing and dance for exercise. With regard to the other witness, John Newton started as an indentured servant. Then he became a crew member, and finally he became a captain of a slave ship. So what he did was he purchased slaves in West Africa and brought them to West Indies. But after his retirement, he repented, he regretted everything that he did during this time of his involvement in slave trade, and to ask for forgiveness, he wrote the song Amazing Grace that you may already know. But you may not know that the author of that song was a slave trader. So that concludes Module 1. Please complete all of the assignments included in this module before moving to the next module.